Hello, welcome to Naresh Technologies. This is Sudhakar Sharma. We are going to discuss about ASP.NET MVC in these entire video sessions. So, we will discuss about what is MVC from the basic level to the complete architecture of MVC, working with MVC. We will see what's new in MVC with this MVC Core. We will be working with MVC Core environment in all our examples, and we will learn how MVC Core works. So, in MVC sessions, before starting with what exactly is MVC, we have to discuss about few points, so that I will give you an overview of what exactly MVC is. Then we can start with the concept of working with MVC. So, before starting with the concept of working with MVC, let us take a look about what exactly MVC is, what ASP.NET MVC is, and what is the architectural background of ASP.NET MVC. For that, first we have to know about design patterns and architectural patterns, because MVC also a design pattern. So, we have to first know about what is the design pattern. So, what are design patterns and what are architectural patterns? Design patterns are nothing but they are the solutions for software design problems that you find in real time development. That means, as a real world developer, when we are building applications, we follow some principles so that will minimize the bugs that we encounter while developing an application, and it completely defines how the objects are created, how the classes are inherited, and how the communication works. That means, entire application development for real world scenario requires some principles to be followed. The advantage of this is we can minimize the bugs, as already these are tested and proven. Better to follow them and build the application. We call these principles as design patterns. So, what is a design pattern in software industry? Design patterns are the solutions for software design problems that you find in real world development. They are about reusable designs and interaction with the objects. Actually, design patterns involves in the communication between objects, designing of entities, and instantiation. There are several design patterns used in the real world, but 23 design patterns are considered as the gang of 4 design patterns. Means these are the foundation for all design patterns. We call these as gang of 4 design patterns. So, the 23 gang of 4 design patterns are the foundation for all the patterns. They are categorized into 3 groups. We have a creational, structural, and behavioral. We are not going in depth about what are these patterns are. We are just having an overview of the design patterns. So, 23 design patterns categorized into 3 groups: creational, structural, and behavioral. So, what are creational patterns? Creational patterns completely deal with object creation mechanism. That means instantiation, creating of objects. And the commonly used creational patterns are, these are all the creational patterns. We have abstract factory, we have builder, factory method, prototype, and singleton. I am not discussing about any one of these patterns as of now, but just let have an overview of what they are. So, creational patterns, they completely deal with instantiation, that means creating of objects. Where we have abstract factory. Abstract factory creates an instance of several families of classes, and builder separates the object construction from its representation, and factory method creates an instance of several derived classes. Prototype it's a fully initialized instance to be copied and used anywhere. And singleton, where a class can have only one instance, one single object. So these are all the patterns that are involved in creation of objects, means object creation mechanism. They are involved in object creation mechanism. They all deal with instantiation, creating of objects. These are all the creational patterns. And what are structural patterns? Structural patterns, they completely deal with the designing of entities, means designing of classes and relationship between the entities, configuring the relationship between the classes. So they completely involved in the relation between the classes and designing the entities. There are so many structural patterns. These are all the structural patterns. We have an adapter that matches the interface of different classes. Bridge separates the object's interface from its implementation. And composite, a tree structure of simple and composite objects. Decorator, add responsibility to the objects dynamically. Facade, a single class that represents an entire subsystem. And flyweight, a fine grain modular instance used for effective sharing. And proxy, that is an object representing another object. These are all the structural patterns. So structural patterns, they completely involved in designing of entities and maintaining the relationship between the entities. We have behavioral patterns. Behavioral patterns are common communication patterns. They are involved in the communication between the objects. So they will define how an object communicates with another object. So many behavioral patterns are there. These are all the behavioral patterns. We have chain of responsibility, which is a way of passing a request between a chain of objects. Command, it encapsulates a command request as an object. Interpreter, a way to include language elements into the program. Iterator, sequentially access the elements of a collection. And mediator defines the simplified communication between classes. Memento, capture and restore an object's internal state. And observer, a way of notifying the changes to a number of classes. Example for our observer is the traditional event driven architecture. It uses an observer pattern. State alters an object's behavior when its state changes. And strategy encapsulates an algorithm inside a class, step by step process to evaluate the concept. And the template method differ the exact steps of an algorithm to a subclass. And visitor defines a new operation to a class without change. So these are all comes under the category of behavioral patterns. So design patterns are the solutions for software design problems. There are several design patterns followed to build applications. They completely involve in object creation mechanism, designing of entities and communication between the objects. Three categories are there: creational, structural and behavioral patterns. Now what is an architectural pattern? Actually architectural patterns and design pattern difference is design patterns involved in designing the application, means only with the objects, with the entities and the relationship between the entities, communication between the objects. But architectural patterns are involved in complete architecture of application. That means they define where to store the data objects, they define how data objects are communicated with the UI. All this communication mechanism of entire software architecture is designed by using the architectural patterns. They define where to put an UI, so where to put the business logic, where to put the data and how these architectures communicate with each other, tiers that we define by using architectural patterns. So architectural patterns in software are also design patterns, but they have a broader scope. Same, they are also design patterns, but they have a broader scope. There are several architectural patterns. These are all the commonly used architectural patterns. a blackboard system, broker pattern, event driven architecture, implicit invocation, layers, microservices, MVC model view controller, MVP model view presenter, MVVM model view model, and your traditional multi-tier architecture, that is a 3-tier or n-tier architecture. These are all architectural patterns, various architectural patterns. So, architectural patterns are same like design patterns, but they have a broader scope. They are always involved in the complete mechanism of how the application functions. That means they are involved in running the application. So, not just only building the application, right. So, these are all design patterns and architectural patterns. So, what exactly MVC is? So, MVC is a architectural design pattern. It is an software architecture pattern. MVC model view controller, it is an architectural pattern originally formulated in 1970 by Trigue as a part of Smalltalk. So, MVC is very old. So, MVC was originally designed for desktop applications. Now, it is being adopted by web applications. Trigue introduced MVC in 1970s. Trigue originally designed this for desktop applications, and now every internet and web applications are using this MVC framework. Code reusability and code separation are the major concerns when MVC was introduced. Trigue was working for a huge project where separation and reusability concerns were there, and he designed this architecture to implement in that scenario. So, MVC is model view controller. What is model view controller? We are going to see that in the later stage. MVC is an architectural design pattern designed by Trigue in 1970 as a part of Smalltalk, and code reusability and separation of concerns, originally designed for desktop applications. Now, it is being adopted by the web applications. So, actually Trigue introduced this MVC architecture. He was working for an oil corporation project. It is a very huge desktop application where the separation concerns were there, and not only separation, reusability concerns. However, by implementing the architecture of MVC, he was able to resolve these problems. So, he formulated MVC pattern with a GUI interface originally designed for desktop applications. And MVC is not only for .NET, various technologies are using MVC. MVC is a very old framework and it is being used for various frameworks. MVC framework is being used by various technologies. So, various MVC frameworks of various technologies like PHP uses MVC by name Cake PHP Code Igniter. Java uses MVC by name Spring. Perl uses MVC by name Catalyst and Dancer. Python using MVC by name Django, Flask, Grok. Ruby using MVC by name Ruby on Rails. JavaScript using MVC by name AngularJS and JavaScript MVC Spine. ASP.NET is using MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. So, .NET framework uses MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. So, MVC frameworks are not new. MVC frameworks are very common and they are already there and being used in various technologies. Now, we need to identify why MVC ASP.NET was introduced. So, what is the reason behind introducing ASP.NET MVC? Why .NET framework comes with ASP.NET MVC? Then we have to look at the history of the evolution of ASP.NET. Then we can understand the concept of working with MVC. That we will see in our next video session. We will discuss about what are the features of MVC and architecture of MVC, and we will discuss about the evolution of MVC various versions. Keep watching YouTube videos in RHIT. Thank you.